It was a rainy October evening when I first heard about the legend of the Hollowbrook Asylum. I was at a local diner, eavesdropping on a conversation between two old men. They spoke in hushed tones, recounting the horrific events that took place there decades ago. My curiosity piqued. I decided to investigate the abandoned asylum, hoping to capture some footage for my paranormal vlog. Hollowbrook Asylum was built in the early 1900s, initially intended to house patients with severe mental illnesses. However, it quickly gained a notorious reputation due to the unethical experiments conducted by Dr. Marcus Valen, the head psychiatrist. The asylum was shut down in the 1960s after a series of mysterious deaths, but it was said that the tormented souls of the patients still haunted the decaying halls. Armed with my camera and a flashlight, I drove to the outskirts of town, where the asylum loomed like a dark sentinel. The gates were rusted and overgrown with ivy, creaking eerily in the wind. I parked my car and approached the entrance, feeling a mixture of excitement and dread. This was it, the perfect setting for a truly terrifying video. The front door of the asylum hung loosely on its hinges, and I slipped inside, my flashlight casting long, wavering shadows on the walls. The air was thick with dust and the unmistakable scent of mold. I started filming, narrating the legend of the asylum as I made my way through the main hall. Many believe that the spirits of Dr. Valen's victims still roam these halls, I said to the camera. Tonight, we're going to find out if there's any truth to the legend of Hollowbrook Asylum. As I explored further, I found patient records scattered on the floor, their pages yellowed and brittle with age. I picked one up and read a few lines. The descriptions of the treatments were horrifying. Electroshock therapy, ice baths, and lobotomies. The more I read, the more I felt a growing sense of unease. The wind howled through the broken windows, and the building seemed to groan in response. I turned a corner and entered what appeared to be the operating room. The metal table in the center was rusted and stained, and the walls were lined with ominous-looking surgical tools. I shuddered, imagining the agony the patients must have endured in this place. Suddenly, my flashlight flickered, casting the room into momentary darkness. When it came back on, I saw a shadow move at the edge of the light. I spun around, heart pounding, but there was no one there. I chalked it up to my imagination and continued filming. As I descended into the basement, the air grew colder, and the smell of decay became almost unbearable. This was where the most disturbed patients were kept, according to the records. The cells were small and cramped, each with heavy iron bars. I shone my flashlight into one of the cells and froze. There, in the corner, was a figure. It was hunched over, its back to me. My heart raced as I slowly approached, my camera capturing every moment. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. The figure didn't move. I reached the cell and shone the flashlight directly at the figure. It was a mannequin, dressed in a tattered patient gown. I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding and laughed nervously. Someone must have placed it there as a prank. I continued exploring the basement, but the sense of unease never left me. Then, I heard it, a faint raspy whisper coming from one of the cells. I turned, shining my light down the row of bars. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice echoing off the damp walls. There was no response, just the oppressive silence. I approached the cell from which the whisper had come and peered inside. At first I saw nothing, but as I looked closer, I noticed scratches on the walls, as if someone had tried desperately to claw their way out. My blood ran cold. Suddenly, the cell door slammed shut behind me with a deafening clang. I jumped back, dropping my flashlight. It rolled away, casting erratic beams of light around the room. I was plunged into darkness. Panic set in as I fumbled for the flashlight, my hands shaking uncontrollably. When I finally found it and turned it back on, the figure from earlier was standing just outside the cell, its eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. I gasped and stumbled backward, tripping over my own feet. The figure moved closer, its movements jerky and unnatural. "Why are you here?" it whispered, its voice echoing in my mind. I was just exploring," I stammered, my heart pounding so hard I thought it would burst. "You shouldn't have come," it said, its voice growing more distorted. "You can never leave." In the sleepy town of Raven's Hollow, there existed a legend that no one dared to speak of after dark: the tale of the Mirror Man. The story goes back decades, originating from an old mansion on the outskirts of town. This mansion, known as Blackwood Manor, was said to be cursed, its halls filled with sorrow and despair. And at the center of it all was the Mirror Man, a spectral figure who could only be seen in reflections. It all began with the tragic story of a man named Samuel Blackwood, the last heir of the Blackwood family. Samuel was a renowned artist, obsessed with capturing the human soul in his portraits. His fixation led him to experiment with mirrors, believing they could trap the essence of a person. However, his obsession took a dark turn when his wife Eleanor mysteriously disappeared. Samuel claimed she was trapped in one of his mirrors, but no one believed him. He was found dead in front of his favorite mirror, his face twisted in terror. Blackwood Manor was abandoned after his death, but the legend of the Mirror Man persisted. They say that if you stand before the mirror in Samuel's old studio at midnight, you can summon the Mirror Man. Driven by curiosity and the desire to debunk the myth, I decided to investigate. It was a cold, moonless night when I arrived at Blackwood Manor. The mansion stood like a specter against the dark sky, its windows broken and its once grand facade covered in ivy. I pushed open the heavy wooden door, which groaned in protest, and stepped inside. The air was thick with dust, and the smell of decay permeated the halls. Armed with a flashlight and a camera, I made my way to Samuel's studio. The room was just as I imagined: easel and brushes scattered, canvases covered in dust, and in the center of the room, the infamous mirror. It was tall and ornate, with a gold frame that had tarnished over the years. The surface of the mirror was cloudy, as if holding secrets of its own. I set up my camera on a tripod, ensuring it had a clear view of the mirror. I checked my watch, 11:55 p.m. I had 5 minutes before midnight. As I waited, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional creak of the old mansion settling. At the stroke of midnight, I stood in front of the mirror, my heart pounding. "Mirror Man," I called out, my voice trembling slightly. "If you're real, show yourself." For a moment, nothing happened. I felt a wave of relief, convinced that the legend was just a story. But then, the room grew colder, and my breath came out in visible puffs. The mirror's surface began to ripple, like water disturbed by a pebble. My reflection twisted and morphed, and then I saw him, a shadowy figure standing behind me in the mirror. I spun around, but the room was empty. I turned back to the mirror, and there he was, closer now. The Mirror Man's face was obscured, but his eyes were unmistakable, cold, dark, and filled with malice. He reached out a hand, and I felt an icy grip on my shoulder. I tried to move, but I was paralyzed, rooted to the spot by an unseen force. The Mirror Man leaned in closer, his whisper echoing in my mind. "You shouldn't have come here." Desperate to escape, I summoned all my strength and broke free from the invisible hold. I grabbed the camera and bolted from the room, my footsteps echoing through the empty halls. I could hear him following, his whispers growing louder, more frantic. "You can't escape. You belong to the mirror now." I burst out of the mansion and into the cold night air, not stopping until I reached my car. I drove away, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. I didn't stop until I was back in the safety of my apartment. It was only then that I dared to review the footage. The video showed me standing before the mirror, calling out to the Mirror Man. The mirror rippled and the shadowy figure appeared, but as I watched, my blood ran cold. The camera had captured more than I had seen. As I ran from the room, the Mirror Man stepped out of the mirror, his form becoming more solid with each step. The last frame showed him standing in the doorway watching me leave. Terrified, I deleted the footage and tried to convince myself it was all a hallucination, a trick of the mind. But the nightmares began that very night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw him, standing in the shadows, waiting. His whispers filled my mind, telling me I could never escape. Days turned into weeks, and the nightmares grew worse. I started seeing him in every reflective surface, mirrors, windows, even puddles of water. His presence was inescapable, his whispers a constant torment. I tried to avoid mirrors, covering them or breaking them, but it was futile. He was always there, lurking just beyond the surface. To this day, I warn others to stay away from Blackwood Manor. The legend of the Mirror Man is real, and some spirits are best left undisturbed. If you ever find yourself tempted to investigate, remember my story. Some mirrors should remain broken, and some shadows are best left in the past. It was a cold, stormy night in November when I decided to investigate the legend of the Blackwood Forest. I had heard countless stories about this place, and my curiosity got the better of me. Armed with a flashlight and a camera, I set out alone to uncover the truth behind the chilling tales. The forest was located just outside the small town of Eldridge. According to the locals, no one who ventured into Blackwood Forest after dark ever returned the same. They spoke of an ancient curse, malevolent spirits, and mysterious disappearances. Determined to debunk these myths, I parked my car at the edge of the forest and stepped into the darkness. The wind howled through the trees, and the leaves rustled ominously as I walked deeper into the woods. The path was barely visible, swallowed by the thick undergrowth. My flashlight cut through the blackness, revealing twisted branches and gnarled roots that seemed to reach out like skeletal hands. As I ventured further, I felt an inexplicable sense of dread. The air grew colder and a thick fog began to roll in, obscuring my surroundings. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees towering like silent sentinels. I pushed on, trying to shake off the growing unease. After about an hour, I stumbled upon an old, dilapidated cabin. Its windows were broken, and the wooden walls were covered in moss and vines. This must have been where the stories originated. I approached cautiously, my heart pounding in my chest. "Hello?" I called out, my voice barely more than a whisper. There was no answer, only the creaking of the cabin in the wind. I pushed open the door and it groaned loudly as it swung inward. The interior was dark and dank, filled with the scent of decay. I shone my flashlight around the room, revealing broken furniture, scattered papers, and a thick layer of dust. In the corner, I spotted an old journal. I picked it up and flipped through the pages, my hands trembling. The entries were filled with frantic scrawls, describing strange occurrences and unearthly sightings. One passage caught my eye. "The forest is alive. It watches. It waits. No one escapes its grasp. The curse is real, and it will claim all who dare enter." A chill ran down my spine as I read those words. Suddenly, I heard a faint whispering coming from the back of the cabin. I turned, my flashlight beam trembling as I scanned the room. The whispers grew louder, turning into guttural, inhuman voices. Panicking, I backed toward the door, but it slammed shut with a force that shook the entire cabin. I was trapped. The voices surrounded me, echoing off the walls. I dropped the journal and bolted for the nearest window, smashing through the glass and tumbling into the cold, damp grass outside. I scrambled to my feet and ran blindly into the forest, the whispers following me. The fog thickened, and the trees seemed to shift and move, blocking my path. My flashlight flickered and died, plunging me into complete darkness. I stumbled and fell, scraping my hands and knees on the rough ground. Desperate, I crawled forward, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The whispers were all around me now, a cacophony of voices chanting in a language I couldn't understand. Then, I saw it. A figure standing just ahead, shrouded in darkness. Its eyes glowed a menacing red, and its form seemed to blend with the shadows. I froze, paralyzed with fear. "Leave this place," it hissed, its voice echoing inside my mind. "You are not welcome here." Gathering the last of my strength, I turned and fled, not daring to look back. I could feel the figure's eyes boring into my back, and the whispers seemed to chase me through the trees. Somehow I managed to find the path and burst out of the forest, collapsing next to my car. Gasping for breath, I looked back at the darkened woods. The whispers had stopped, and the forest was silent once more. I scrambled into my car and sped away, not stopping until I reached the safety of my home. To this day, I can't explain what happened that night. The cabin, the whispers, the figure, all of it seemed like a nightmare. But the fear was real and the memories still haunt me. The Blackwood Forest holds its secrets tightly, and I learned the hard way that some legends are best left alone. If you ever find yourself in Eldridge, heed the warnings of the locals. Stay away from the Blackwood Forest. Some places are cursed, and some mysteries are better left unsolved. The forest is alive, and it waits for the next soul foolish enough to enter its dark embrace. The figure lunged at me and I screamed, dropping the flashlight again. I scrambled to my feet and ran blindly through the basement, my only thought to escape this nightmare. I could hear the figure's footsteps behind me, getting closer and closer. I burst through a door and found myself in a long, narrow corridor. The walls were lined with old photographs of the asylum's staff and patients. Their faces were twisted in expressions of agony and despair. I ran down the corridor, the photographs seeming to come to life, their eyes following me. At the end of the corridor, I found a staircase and climbed it 2 steps at a time. I emerged back in the main hall, the front door in sight. I didn't stop running until I was outside, the cold night air hitting me like a slap in the face. I reached my car and fumbled with the keys, my hands still shaking. As I drove away, I glanced back at the asylum. The windows glowed with an eerie, unholy light, and I could see figures moving inside, their eyes glowing just like the one in the basement. I never spoke of what happened that night at Hollowbrook Asylum. I deleted the footage and tried to forget the terror I experienced. But the nightmares persisted, and I knew that the spirits of Dr. Valen's victims were still trapped in that cursed place. If you ever find yourself near Hollowbrook Asylum, heed my warning: do not enter. The horrors within those walls are all too real, and some legends are best left undisturbed. The asylum still waits for its next victim, and you may not be as lucky as I was to escape its grasp.